There are a number of stories in the Scriptures that are noted for their distinctive qualities and characteristics or details. For example, we have one story of Jesus curing a leper. But then there's the story of Jesus curing 10 lepers, in which one of them comes back and thanks Jesus. And there are the stories of Jesus gathering with tax collectors and sinners, such as there's the story in Matthew's Gospel of the conversion and the call of Matthew, in the Gospel of Luke of the conversion and the call of Levi, both tax collectors. But then there's the story of Zacchaeus, the little man who climbed a tree so that he could see Jesus. And that's kind of one of those qualities of the story that makes it memorable for us. That because of the crowd, he climbed a sycamore tree, and there he is hanging on the tree so that he could see Jesus passing by. But there's a lot more to the story than that, and it's in how he responds to the criticism that he gets when Jesus goes to stay with him in his house. Of course, as we see, culturally, this is something that was atrocious for the people of the time, because tax collectors were particularly loathed in that society. They were the turncoats. They were the traitors to a certain degree, because the taxes they collected was for the Roman occupier. And so they collected a revenue for the hated Romans who occupied the promised land. And so no doubt the people were very scandalized, often intensely scandalized, when Jesus associated with them. And in this particular case, Jesus dined and stayed with Zacchaeus in his home. So the people were very upset. One might say, using modern rhetoric, they were triggered by it. But it said everyone around them was scandalized by this, him holding up this tax collector as something good by staying in his home. And as people are wont to do, they wasted no time whatsoever criticizing it. And this was at a time in which we didn't have email, Twitter, and texting. When people get upset over something, some say they get triggered, I say they just get their ditties in a dander. There's very little thought. I always tell people, like if it's a homily, give it till Wednesday. Sleep on it. But like here, they didn't waste any time. And what did they do? They said he's going to the house of a sinner. In other words, they were boxing Zacchaeus in. They were determining who he was and what he was about. Nothing about his personality or his own character. He's a sinner. And they responded by defining him according to their prejudices and their resentments for him and his profession. But it's in his response that we see perhaps the character of Zacchaeus come forth. And it's in the response I'd like to spend a little time talking about, because in the response and how this response has developed over time, we are reminded of a number of things, some of which I talked about last week, about the great respect that the Hebrew people had for the language, the words, even the very letters of that language, that God spoke his word to them, and that we should have a reverence for our own language, which God speaks to us. This week is a question of translation, because about 15, 20 years ago, a new lectionary was developed based upon the current translation in the New American Bible, which is the Bible from which the lectionary is taken. Perhaps a more accurate translation to the original languages, which reminds us of three important things we need to remember when we're dealing with the Scriptures and even our reading of it and interpreting the Scriptures. One, the Bible was not written yesterday. Two, the Bible was not written in English. And three, the Bible was not written in the United States. It was written in very ancient cultures, different systems, and in very ancient languages. And sometimes there's a struggle to translate. You look at books like Hosea for one, Job for another, and certain parts you might even see the verses in different orders, because the flow and meaning makes more sense in English if the verses are rearranged, because the ancient language was so different from our language today. But in the case of Zacchaeus' response, up until about 15 years ago, the reading read differently than it read for today. Let me review what it reads today. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Behold, half my possessions, Lord, I shall give to the poor. And if I have extorted anything from anyone, I shall repay it 4 times over. Now, one of the ways a tax collector made his living is he charged a little more than the regular tax because he had to have an income. But Zacchaeus really doesn't talk about that as much. He talks about extorting, using by intimidation and blackmail to get more money. But what he says is a sense of, from now on, Lord, I shall give to the poor. I shall repay 4 times over. But in the original, I should say not the original, but the previous translation in English, it read somewhat differently, and it has great implications for the character of Zechariah. It used to say, but Zacchaeus stood his ground and said to the Lord, behold, half my possessions, Lord, I give to the poor. If I have extorted anything from anyone, I repay it 4 times over. See the difference? See the difference? Now, I'm not a linguist. I'm not such a scripture scholar as to know how to read the original language and translate it. And my presumption would be that the latest translation is probably the more accurate one. But I have to admit, folks, I like the older one better. Because what does it express in Zacchaeus? He stood his ground. He was not going to let these people, from their hatreds or their prejudices, box him and define him the way they were. He stood his ground and said, that is not who I am, this is who I am. I give to the poor, I repay fourfold. And it's a tremendous example, bringing the story just a little bit more than to being the story of the little man who climbed a tree. It becomes the story of the tax collector who stood up for himself, who held his ground. And isn't that an example for so many of us, especially when it comes to our faith and defending our faith, defending our church, defending ourselves, our brothers and sisters, our parish, and so on? Have we ever found ourselves in a position where people are highly critical of what we believe in the church we belong to? And did we stand our ground? Or did we just simply passively let people say what they want and box us into whatever their prejudices or hatreds or misinterpretations happen to be? Zacchaeus could be a great example of that. And it was in that example that Jesus responded to him and said, this man is a true descendant of David. Salvation has come to his house. And what are some of the examples? Of course, we have no lacking of them in our society today. Just in the last 3 years or so, people made the distinction of following the science. And a lot of times it was the comparative sense, as opposed to those of us who have religious faith and superstitions and believing in mythologies and fairy tales. Those of us who are Christian, especially, we don't follow the science. Some would even say, we don't believe in the science. To which I would say, really? How many are aware that if it weren't for the Christian faith in general and the Catholic Church in particular, there would be no modern science? Modern science owes its existence to the Christian faith and the Catholic Church. That's another homily for some other time, so stay tuned. Some would even say, well, the church doesn't believe in evolution or the real scientific progress. They believe in the mythology and the fairy tales of the Bible. To which I say, really? Are you aware that the father of geography is Nicholas Steno, or should I say, blessed Nicholas Steno, a bishop, who in his studies of geography actually came to the conclusion that, the creative process was probably quite a lot longer, a few thousand million years. After all, he looked at geography. And are they aware that the father of the Big Bang Theory, the scientist who proposed the Big Bang Theory, was actually a Catholic priest from Belgium, Father Nicholas Steno, who even convinced Einstein of the Big Bang Theory? Well, slavery is in the Bible, and it doesn't condemn slavery, and Christianity actually fosters slavery throughout history. Really? Are they aware that it was an early Christian principle that Christians did not enslave other Christians? After all, didn't Paul say to Philemon, receive Onesimus not as a slave, but now as a beloved brother? And the more and more Europe became Christian, the less and less slavery was a factor, to the point that the civilization that did away with slavery first was Western European Christianity. Oh, of course, sure. Colonialism sure brought slavery back, especially here in our Christian society of the United States. So certainly Europe brought slavery back, yes, but that was after an event we call the Protestant Reformation, when people were turning away from the teachings of the church and the practice of that faith. And actually, slavery got on the rise again post-Enlightenment, a time in which more and more we were following the science. Well, didn't Christianity burn witches throughout its history? Actually, witch burning shot up post-Enlightenment, when we were, okay, I won't say it again. And my all-time favorite, what about the scandals? I'll tell you, folks, if they ever bring that up to you, you know you've won the argument. Not that I defend the scandals, terrible events, but people bring that up to discredit our church as part of their nuclear option. How could we possibly come back from that? To which I remind them that at least in the Archdiocese of San Francisco and the Diocese of Los Angeles, the church, the only institution in history to aggressively address this issue within its own ranks, has done such a thorough job over the last 20 years that now organizations that exclusively work with youngsters now consult the church on how to better protect the safety of people of all ages. Hold your ground. Defend the faith. Don't let us be boxed in by people's misconceptions, prejudices, hatreds, and so on for our faith and what it stands for, or seek to diminish us because of our imperfect humanity and our sins. We don't excuse them, but they don't define us as a people who are saved any more than being a tax collector, hated by his society, defined Zacchaeus. Let me give you one more story that illustrates this. I know a number of families in Southern California whose children don't go to the local Catholic school. They go to a closer school run by an evangelical church, which isn't known for being the most pro-Catholic denomination in the world. But they offer a good education, and all these are Catholic children from Catholic families who go to this school. But their parents were very clear with the administration of the school. If we get the slightest hint that they are getting a one whiff of anti-Catholic rhetoric in this education, we will pull our children from the school. And now, whenever they teach religion or history or things about faith or the Bible, some of them actually check with the parents. Is this okay? You don't have any problem with this teaching? And they're good. They're really good Catholic families. But they're standing their ground. They're holding fast to be true to that faith. We are called to do the same. And so whichever translation is the more accurate one, we see how just a change in tense can have big ramifications for the character that is being told in this story. So much more than whether it's just simply a story of a little man who climbed a tree. If we understand it one way, it becomes the story of the tax collector who stood his ground and stood up for himself. Let us see an example in Zacchaeus, who did not let people box him in and define him based upon their rash, quick-made complaints. But let us stand up for ourselves as people of faith. The community we belong to is a community of faith. The church to which we belong as we profess that faith, and Jesus who we profess our faith in. Let us not be passive in the face of unjust ridicule, but let us stand our ground. And who knows, we too may one day be told, along with Zacchaeus, salvation has come to your house, because you know what it means to be a son and daughter of Abraham.